Well, hello everyone. Connor here. Now, it's been a while, hasn't it? Probably about 6 weeks since I last broadcast in this format from my former show at lotuseaters.com. And if you haven't been caught up on all of the prior episodes of Tomlinson Talks, they are still available over there on the website behind the paywall. You're more than welcome to go and support the excellent work of my former colleagues, and I wish them well. Tomlinson Talks was started as a Monday night talk radio segment with my old friend Kevin O'Sullivan back in 2021. And when they became Talk TV, and that slot no longer existed because Kevin's show no longer existed, great shame, taken over by Piers Morgan for a short-lived period instead, when his face was on every bus and billboard in the country for a while, I just decided to repurpose the name for my Substack. And that is still going, and you can go over there and get various amounts of paid analysis and free articles a couple of times a week. And then I thought I would revive the alliterative label for my show over at lotuseaters.com. But now I am no longer venturing into not-so-sunny Swindon once a week. In the last 6 weeks, I thought, isn't it strange how a show of this format just doesn't exist in the UK? You've got Real America's Voice and The Daily Wire and The Blaze and all sorts of other alternative media ventures popping up around the United States, and it contributed to great success to the election of Donald Trump for a second term in 2024. So it's clearly a powerful format that people resonate with. And I realised with the absence of Tomlinson Talks on Lotus Eaters, nobody else is picking up that torch. But the show, despite being locked behind a paywall for a year, had an outsized amount of political impact. I mean, I broke the story of Hope Not Hate's False Passport after its odious documentary in October 2024. I covered things like the rape gang scandal for a number of weeks and the Southport slayings with brand new details that most people weren't amplifying. We did all sorts of important things to the extent of where I was in an event in Westminster a few weeks ago, and a former Conservative minister came up to me and said, "Oh, I'm gutted you left Lotus Eaters. I loved your show." Now, I would have loved if said Conservative government would have taken my advice and implemented a few policies that I had suggested and hadn't cooed out repeated prime ministers to install a very unpopular Rishi Sunak. Point aside, if it was that influential when it was behind a paywall, I thought, imagine the influence it might have if there were no paywall at all. So I'm pleased to announce that once a week, from now on, Tomlinson Talks is back. And this time, it's available in full, for free, for everyone. Without further ado, let's get back into it. So the top story this week that I wanted to talk about is the brewing Indian-Pakistan war in Great Britain. If you've been paying attention to the warnings of King's College London academic David Betts in his very sober Canadian tone, and I'm sure he's commiserating over today's election results, but by the by, you will have noticed that in his interviews with Louise Perry or Peter Whittle over at the New Culture Forum, he has warned about the inevitability of a civil war in Britain. He wrote a very foreboding article in a military strategy magazine, I believe in 2023, about this, and has subsequently explained that the government in the UK, by implementing a two-tier society through everything from the recent Sentencing Council guidance that was scrapped at the 11th hour to things like the Equality Act, which under Section 149 and the Public Sector Equality Duty make it legal and mandatory to discriminate against the indigenous white British host population, men, heterosexuals and Christians, in order to mandate equality of representation of minority identity groups or protected characteristics across the board. With legislation like this, the native population will be aware of the downgrading of their privileged status in their own country. And so vigilante groups might attack critical infrastructure like substations, the sort we saw set ablaze mysteriously in Heathrow a couple of months ago, or they might clash with Muslim militias, the types that we saw were told to stash their weapons in the mosque, or occupied a roundabout, slashed the tyres on a Sky News van, and lacerated the liver of a pubgoer in Birmingham in the riots that followed the Southport murders last summer. David Betts has been very prescient on these warnings, and I think they represent a legitimate threat to the security of the United Kingdom. But what I think is a greater threat, and is something that Sam Bidwell of the Adam Smith Institute warned about presciently on the 17th of April, is the potential for an India-Pakistan civil war to happen in Britain. Now, for those who don't know, on the 22nd of April, in India-administered Kashmir, there was a terror attack by an Islamist group called Lashkar-e-Taliban, Again, I know my pronunciation's terrible, but I shouldn't have to care about this. But thanks to immigration, I do. And in Kashmir, they killed 26 people and injured 20 more. Now, Kashmir is a disputed territory between India and Pakistan, and the India-Pakistan border flag-raising ceremonies have always been a sort of spectacle of delight. This subcontinental ethnic and religious feud gets to silly levels of performativity, with the Indian military, hanging off of motorcycles in feats of acrobatics, or them outdoing themselves and straining their hamstrings to kick above head height and peacock one another. Gets a bit dangerous, though, when a terror attack happens, because now Pakistan has suspended all trade with India. They've suspended all flights with India. Narendra Modi, suggesting that somehow the Pakistani government are behind this, said that India will identify, track and punish every terrorist, their handlers and their backers, and we will pursue them to the ends of the earth. Now, I expect nothing less from a country whose nationals have been slaughtered by one of their ethnic and religious adversaries just over the border. We saw the same thing with Israel and Hamas. What we didn't see, of course, in the UK with the Pakistani rape gangs, is the government pursue the perpetrators who preyed upon white English children for racial and religious reasons with equivalent force. And that is actually a condemnation of the English government for betraying their own people, whereas perfectly understandable that the Indians and the Israelis are going after terrorists who would threaten their own people in such an existential fashion. The problem with all of this, now, again, I wouldn't normally care about our former colonies' inability to govern themselves. They're just sort of silly countries on the subcontinent over there, and I would leave them to their own devices. However, thanks to decades of mass migration and a multicultural appeasement strategy, we now have, as of the 2021 census and subsequent post-Brexit years of Boris wave migration, at least legally registered in the country, 3 million Indians and 1.9 million Pakistanis. 1 million Indians, by the way, have come in the last 4 years, and we won't know the numbers for the Labour government until May the 22nd, so we could have even more. And we definitely have more in total, because we know that for a while, Indians were making up a large share of migrants crossing the English Channel in small boats from France, despite India being, well, I'd say a safe country, not at the moment because of the India-Pakistan war, and certainly not if you want food that doesn't want to give you an upset stomach. But by the by, so we've got a large ethno-religious political bloc of both factions, India and Pakistan, settled in the UK for decades, and also lots of new and recent arrivals. And we can see how febrile this ethno-religious tension is, because in 2022, after a cricket match between the two nations, Leicester, one of the UK's major cities, Leicester, Birmingham, Manchester, London, Leeds, they're all majority minority now. They're all majority non-English, rather. Leicester was made an ungovernable anarchic cesspit because after said cricket match, Hindu and Muslim factions, mainly Pakistani and Indian factions, decided to riot for a month over a cricket match. So a full-scale war between the two countries could ignite even further tensions. And we saw this last Friday, by the way, because there were protests outside the Pakistani embassy where the Indians were waving Indian and Israeli flags, and the Pakistanis were waving Pakistani and Palestinian flags. So it shows that there is an additional layer of international religious and political solidarity that codes one way or the other in this conflict. So you're seeing sort of parallel religious and ethnic blocs emerge in Britain that have been apported against the wishes of the host population, who have voted against mass migration in every election and referendum since 1974 through 2024, and have been punished with unlimited, unwanted levels of migration instead, and will now have to barricade themselves in their homes if said subcontinental ethnic and religious dispute turns into a full-scale civil war in the streets of Britain's cities. And during this protest, and this was quite concerning, this is Colonel Tamir Rahat of the Pakistani military. He was accused of motioning to slit the throats of the protesters. Until then, it was silly fun and games, right? It was a bit of a mix between a protest and a dance-off, which was kind of weird, and it was obnoxious that they were blaring their incomprehensible music in the middle of the streets. It sounded a little bit like that argument between the two taxi drivers, and I think it was Birmingham, that you bloody da-da-da-da-da, expletives that I will censor for YouTube. But point being, it might have been amusing if not for the very real threat from a military official, allegedly, to slit the throats of his ideological enemies. And this does go as high as not just the high commissions of Pakistan and India here, but in the British government itself, because we have very powerful ethno and religious lobbies that have taken root within the British state. And this is because of a large volume of first and second generation Pakistani and Indian MPs and politicians. So, for example, the Conservative Party codes Hindu or codes Indian. Reason is, of course, they've had some very prominent politicians of Indian heritage. I'm thinking former Chancellor and then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, or former Home Secretary, now Shadow Foreign Secretary Priti Patel, on whose watch there has been a suspiciously large amount of Indian migration occur. Rishi Sunak, of course, was the first Hindu Prime Minister and first British Asian Prime Minister, and he celebrated Diwali. He is always identified as a British Indian, which is why all of the Indian press, when he was installed, not elected, were celebrating, saying that, the sun has set finally on the British Empire and now an Indian is governing Britain. It's sort of folded back in on itself. And they recognised a sense of ethnic solidarity there, which makes it absurd now that Rishi Sunak is claiming to be as English as you and me because he owns a Labrador and likes Star Wars or something. And then most suspicious was Priti Patel, while Home Secretary was in a Foreign Affairs Select Committee hearing. It might have been after. She was Home Secretary. And she said that, using a quote from Prime Minister Modi, that Britain's Indian diasporas are, quote, living bridges. And she proposed to leverage that demographic into democratic pressure to ensure that the British state aligns more with the Hindutva regime in India's foreign and domestic policy goals. Basically, we've got Indians here, and they can pressure our politicians to do good things for India while in Britain, which obviously means more Indians. And at the last election, this is something as well Sam Bidwell has covered. He's very good on this stuff. You really should read his work on The Critic and over at Knights of the Green Shield on Substack. There was a Hindu manifesto. There's also a Sikh manifesto. I know the British Board of Deputies always puts out a Jewish manifesto. Don't know if they did last election, though. And of course, there is the Muslim Vote Organisation we'll get onto later. So there's all these sort of sectarian lobby groups that have taken root in Britain. But in the Hindu manifesto, which said that it wants to liberalise Indian visas to ensure that the elderly parents and dependents of Indian workers can come over and stay in Britain. Bear in mind, each one costs the British taxpayer £465,000 by the average life expectancy age of 81. And over their lifetime, as we've seen from data from the Netherlands and Denmark, these people are never net tax-paying contributors on average, even if they enter at prime working age. If they're past working age, then they're just a drain on the taxpayer, and I don't suppose they provide much in benefits to the taxpayer in the form of brand new barbershops and vape shops. I think we can do without. We can cut our own hair and smoke our own fruity fluid. Thank you very much. But anyway, the Hindu manifesto demanded that we import more elderly Indians, and this was signed by a Tory candidate called Amit Jogia. Imagine my shock. But then there's also another candidate, Bob Blackburn, I think his name is, white British chap, but because he's in a heavily Indian area, he's been given awards by Indian diaspora lobbying groups. He has pushed for Indian issues in Parliament, and it's because he wants to retain his safe seat. So he's playing the politics of ethnic and religious bloc voting. And so are the Labour Party, as I've covered for Courage Media before. They are petrified of the growth of the sectarian Muslim vote, members of whom were flirting for a while with now proscribed group Hizb ut-Tahrir, who, if you remember, in the immediate aftermath of October the 7th, gathered in the streets of London to call for Muslim armies to rise up for jihad. Not great. Hizb ut-Tahrir also, by the way, were lobbying the Home Office and Prevent to downgrade the recording of Islamophobia, of Islamic terrorism, and calling it Islamophobia, and seem to have been successful. So this Muslim sectarian bloc is very interested in Islamic sectarian issues. The Labour Party are petrified of the growth of this bloc because many of their cabinet ministers, including Jess Phillips, Wes Streeting, their seats, and Shaban Mahmood, their seats are under threat in heavily Muslim areas, and they actually lost one of their shadow ministers, Jonathan Ashworth, who is now making a career of being an apologist for Starmer's government and going around being the Ofcom mandated stooge on GB News. So what the Labour Party are doing is they're prioritising Pakistani sectarian interests, and this is where Tahir Ali, the Right Honourable Member for Mirpur, Pakistan, comes in, because he was obviously lobbying using a letter-writing campaign for the British government to help build an airport in Mirpur, Pakistan, the exact region where most of the Pakistani rape gang perpetrators come from. And he also stood up in Parliament at the start of this year asking Keir Starmer to ban the desecration of the texts of the Abrahamic religions. He was calling upon a UN resolution that said that basically burning the Quran is a hate crime. for which people who have done that in protest have been prosecuted in this country and killed in places like Sweden. So he is obviously prioritising sectarian, ethnic and religious concerns, Pakistani Muslim concerns, after he was roundly ridiculed by the likes of yours truly, who ratioed him into the dirt on Twitter by saying we don't want an airport in Mirpur unless it receives more deportations than it does facilitate departures. He then got up in front of a group of Pakistanis in Birmingham, while rubbish is piling high in the streets in his constituency, thanks to the bin strike, and said, we need this airport. Also there was Ayub Khan MP, about whom I wrote on Substack, who said that the Pakistani rape gangs are a false right-wing narrative spread to sow division.
So when the right-wing media and those that seek to undermine, they are using a false narrative. And there's nothing new in that, because we know what they have ran in the past, whether it's in relation to the people that stand up for human rights, for Palestine in Kashmir, whether it's to do with grooming gangs. It's a narrative that is done in order to sow division. And we must prevent that from happening. And one of the ways that we achieve that is to make sure that the moment a false narrative is arisen, that we address it immediately.
No, I think that 80% of the perpetrators being Pakistani Muslims means that there's a disproportionate problem with Pakistani Muslim enclaves in Britain, raping and abusing white working class English girls, denigrating them, subjecting them to torture while they're reading Quran verses at them, calling them white slags, white whores, shouting at ticket conductors when they're caught for riding on the train without paying, many such cases, that white girls are only good for one thing. As recent transcripts read out in Parliament by Katie Lamb have found, one Pakistani perpetrator said, we're here to F white girls and F the government, meaning there's a transparently political angle to these crimes. But no, Ayub Khan is willing to downplay them because of ethnic and religious solidarity with the perpetrators and with, of course, the family members who have covered up their crimes, who have said to Yasmin Ali Harbi Brown that the white girls basically brought it upon themselves because the way they dress, by Allah, is shameful. Or of course, during the trial in 2024 in Rotherham, Charlie Peters covered this. He was sat in the gallery and one of the girls, one of the children of the rapists, called out, "I love you, Dad," even after her father was sentenced for all these crimes. So these unrepentant child abusers are doing this for racial and religious reasons. And yet, Ayub Khan, even yesterday in Parliament during the emergency statement with Jess Phillips, got up and said, well, we might want to talk about how all individuals abhor child abuse and the rapists can come from the background of any race, any creed, any religion, and they just have blackened souls. There might be people with blackened souls here, you know. But we must only talk about it in a way which doesn't fan the flames of hate.
Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Child sexual exploitation is a vile and despicable crime that cuts across all sections of our society, perpetrated by individuals with blackened souls. They come from all races, all creeds, religions, backgrounds. All law-abiding citizens want justice for the victims of these horrific acts. Will the Minister agree that our focus must be on supporting the victims of exploitation and on stopping the perpetrators, but that it must be done in such a way that does not fan the flames of hate to innocent groups of people who would, like all law-abiding citizens, condemn these acts?
I mean, of course I agree, and I want to see perpetrators held accountable. What I can say without any doubt, though, that in the past there have been people who have, as other local inquiries have told us, that people have covered up for seemingly, whether asked to or not, multicultural reasons, and that cannot stand. That said, we will always follow the facts and make sure that we are dealing completely and utterly with that.
Now, even Jess Phillips, who looks haggard now because I think the weight of her conscience is bringing itself to bear on her, even she said, look, the exact chilling effect you're perpetuating around the racial and religious taboos about the Pakistani rape gangs is the reason it was covered up for so long, so we can't afford to do this if we want justice for the victims. But the only reason that had such purchase in Britain, this is my point, is because of the powerful Pakistani lobbying groups who embedded themselves in local councils, who have sympathetic MPs, who had members of the House of Lords, one of whom was convicted for child rape, by the way. Without that, they wouldn't have a foothold in politics to ensure that that chilling effect stops any conversations or actions around the Pakistani rape gang, to ensure that vast amounts of foreign aid are still funneled to Pakistan despite them giving the death penalty for Christian apostates from Islam. And so all of this is pertinent to the fact that if an Indian and Pakistani civil war kicks off, particularly over the issue of Kashmir, by the way, because Kashmir, an independent Kashmir, if you deny an independent Kashmir, that's decreed Islamophobic under the guidance set forth by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Islamophobia, which the current sitting Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, helped write with Hope Not Hate, lying communist activist group. It was adopted by Camden Council as well as 49 other councils. And in there, they said the denial of an independent Palestine and an independent Kashmir is itself Islamophobic. So if we're signing up to these sort of Islamophobia blasphemy laws to run our country, and we have a large diaspora of politically active Pakistanis, with Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar saying that Pakistanis need to use the Labour Party as its vehicle to ascend to positions of leadership and then work in Pakistani interests at a recent conference, if we have that, then if a war breaks out between Indian and Pakistani citizens, who can all vote, by the way, because of the 1948 British Nationality Act allowing Commonwealth citizens to vote even if they're not British citizens, then that means that we could have factions of street rioters on both India and Pakistan sides, and the state split down the middle with independent Muslim candidates and the Labour Party desperately stopping the Muslim vote from breaking for them, siding with Pakistan, or at least coding Pakistani as they code Palestine, and the Conservative Party, now that David Cameron doesn't have his finger on any levers of foreign influence, the Conservative Party coding Hindutva, coding Indian and coding Israeli. And so this could spill over, essentially, into a large-scale ethno-conflict that doesn't involve the British host population who didn't want them here in the first place at all. Very concerning. Personally, I think, we don't have to tolerate any of this. We could just shut down foreign lobbying. We could stop mass immigration. We could make it a very unwelcome place to live in Britain for such extensive foreign lobbying efforts. But instead, our politicians have chosen another path for us. So very frustrating. Meanwhile, the Met Police I decided to do training exercises in their Gravesend facility for upcoming summer riots. The Ministry of Justice has made more prison places available for anticipated summer riots, like in 2024 when they locked up non-violent protesters like Peter Lynch and people who made ill-advised X and Facebook posts like Julie Sweeney or Lucy Connolly for the crime of being upset about Axel Rudolph murdering 3 girls and stabbing 10 more at Taylor Swift dance class in Southport. Instead, the Met Police have decided during their riot training to confront people dressed up in Union Jack flags. Don't worry, they said, after I and a few others tweeted about this on Twitter, brought a lot of attention to it, they said, and I quote, "The Union flag being there was entirely coincidental." Are you sure about that? Reminder, Mohammed Kosbar, one of the Met Police's Muslim community advisors, had to be sacked in February of 2024 because he praised Hamas as master of the martyrs of the resistance. So that explains why they might be enacting two-tier policing around the Palestine marches versus a few British people getting pretty upset about dead girls, and why they're now preparing themselves to set the security state against the native population, even though the threat of an India-Pakistan civil war in Britain's streets is a much greater risk. And also, the Met Police said, "It is disappointing we are increasingly having to challenge this sort of misinformation, which only serves to increase divisions and tensions." I think the only thing increasing divisions and tensions here is the world historical levels of mass third world migration and the importing of tribal minorities who either hijack the democratic system and vote along the lines of ethnic and religious blocs, whereas the indigenous host population vote along individual lines for parties and political topics. Or, if they don't get their way, they riot in the streets and recreate the conditions of a third world hellhole by either piling rubbish dysfunctionally up in Birmingham or setting light to shops and beating each other with sticks in Leicester. We could choose another path. Unfortunately, our political elite have decided against this. And, of course, the issue's only going to get worse, because there's another story that I thought I'd focus on, and this is the Serco scandal, and the fact that Liberal Democrat MPs are trying to allow illegals to vote. So there's a Liberal Democrat MP called Vera Hobhouse. She's a German immigrant, and that's relevant. And she is in Bath, one of the most quintessentially English, high trust and homogenous places in the country. And she's promoting the launch of a paper in Parliament which says that all immigrants, including illegal immigrants, should get the vote. The paper is called What If Everyone Could Vote? Mapping Unenfranchised Residents Across the UK. Now, unenfranchised is an insidious, very Rousseauian way of framing it, because if you notice the way they coach this language, the default position of every single human being, per that framing, is that they have the vote. They are franchised. And so if they are unenfranchised, some hidden hand of oppression is withdrawing their right to participate in egalitarian fashion in the political process. I'd like to coin a Connor's law. I've said this before, but if you go looking in a confusing news story for the blank slate, you will find it as the underlying logic to that news story. So in this instance, everyone starts from the position of being free and equal and enfranchised. And per progressive logic, if they were to participate without any barriers into the political process, because we are all free and equal blank slates, they'd come to the conclusion that voting for Labour or the Liberal Democrats or the Greens or the Democrats in the US or the Liberal Party in Canada are in their best interest. Because, of course, the progressives are speaking for everyone. They're the equality parties. And so, if we just remove the barriers to entry, arbitrary things like who's legal in the country and who isn't, and who's old enough to vote, and who hasn't committed a crime, pointless distinctions like that. If we just remove those, then we'll all vote for the egalitarian utopia that the likes of the Liberal Democrats are trying to bring into being. It's interesting, though, because the Liberal Democrats, for those outside the UK, they want to exist in something akin to Sylvanian families or a Beatrix Potter book, right? Their version of England are these 18th century architecture towns that are populated with people that are the equivalent of talking animals and straw hats, right? Full of English eccentrics, very polite. They say please and thank you when they get on the bus. They clap when the plane lands. They queue. And they know maybe one nice Indian chap who's their local doctor. And they don't see how importing unlimited numbers of people from sub-Saharan Africa or the Indian subcontinent might somehow threaten that. Because there's no logical connection in their mind to enough people being in one place, believing one thing, changing the conditions of a country. To them, the soil is kind of magic. As soon as your souls make contact with it, you become as indistinguishably British as Henry VIII or Winston Churchill, who I'm sure they would call a racist and far right, were they transported to this time and see what they've done with the place. However, they don't understand that these people in a large enough number make the exact country that they've come from, which is undesirable. They just think that a lack of education and economic opportunities is why those countries are the way they are. It's not like intractable cultural preferences that don't magically fall away the moment they step through the passport gates of Heathrow and Gatwick, or, heaven forbid, wash up on Dover Beach from a dinghy from France. However, this delusion does not stop them. And so this Liberal Democrat MP has partnered with the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust, who Charlotte Gill on Substack of Woke Waste and Doge UK has done excellent work digging into, spent 17 million in funding since 2015, including £878,024 on Lib Dem councillors and £694,145 to the Lib Dem party itself. The Rowntree Foundation are also funding the Fabian Society, whose logo is a wolf in sheep's clothing, and they're the oldest socialist group in the country, and the Migrant Democracy Project, who wrote this paper. And they believe every resident, no matter where they are from, should have equal access to democracy. Again, see the blank slate in action. The Lib Dems, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and the Migrant Democracy Project have produced and promoted this report. And in the foreword, it says, 1 in 6 residents in England and Wales were born abroad. That's 16% of the population. As our society changes, our democracy needs to remain fit for purpose and remain inclusive of all members of the community. Now, again, very blank slate. The premise is that every single person is indistinguishable, and as soon as they make contact with Britain and its institutions, the scales shall fall from their eyes and they will all vote for freedom and equality. They won't form ethnic and religious sectarian blocs like the Muslim vote or those pushing the Hindu manifesto, and leverage an outsized influence on democracy to ensure that tribal minoritarian concerns are made the priority of British politics rather than things like cleaning sewage out of the waters or making sure the trains aren't full of people that are playing music out loud on speakerphone, which are actually the Lib Dems' core issues. I mean, if you monitored the Lib Dems campaign at the last election, Ed Davey ran as a kind of Brewster's Millions candidate, kind of anti-political candidate. His campaign involved stunts of him pratfalling off of paddleboards or going on rides at Alton Towers. He's now doing these sort of weird dances in front of a camera on TikTok. That's going to get clipped, isn't it? Of him defying Donald Trump with the latest sort of shuffling dad dance trend. He's in the mold of Mark Carney, basically. He wants to position himself as a Europhile, as supporting Ukraine, as being compassionate to refugees, as being pro-trans, as being against the big bad meanies of Trump and Netanyahu, I suppose, and extolling about the loss of life in Gaza. All of these things are absolute luxury beliefs because they are in the most sheltered, leafy suburbs and towns that have been hitherto unmolested by mass migration in England. And so they can support all of these beliefs without ever needing to make contact with reality. Well, a policy like this, a paper like this that says that illegal migrants can vote might end up bringing the downsides of diversity into those Lib Dem neighbourhoods. Now, the paper complains 4.4 million residents are unenfranchised in parliamentary elections. So that hypothetically counts illegal immigrants in the country. We have a minimum of 1.2 million here. The last time we checked that was Pew Research in 2017. As soon as the Boris wave of migration came in and unprecedented numbers from low-cost countries like the Third World or China came in, the Home Office have just stopped counting visa overstays. So we have no idea how many illegal immigrants in the country, but it's at least 1.2 to 2 million at this point. They're complaining that people like that can't vote. Presumably because they think that, if they just give them the right to vote, they'll vote for them, the Freedom and Equality Party, rather than voting for the Hindu Party or the Islam Party or whether the other sectarian interest block springs up. And they say, and their chief complaint is that per the 1948 British Nationality Act that gives Commonwealth citizens the vote, this is, quote, intimately connected with the colonial history of the United Kingdom. You know what? You're absolutely right. Thank you, Liberal Democrat MP. Let's get rid of it then. This is why the Liberal Democrats are actually coding as the accidentally most racist party in the UK. There's this video that Ed Davey put out the other day saying that he's going to give fines to people who play music and social media clips and TikToks out loud on trains because it's noisy and uncomfortable. And I agree with him, perfectly reasonable. He doesn't realise that that's going to have a disparate impact. Because I would ask Ed Davey, why has that increased dramatically since 2021, when something happened and Boris Johnson and Priti Patel just opened the floodgates to mass migration from outside of Europe, where in common culture, there's no such thing as a public space. There's just your house and the wilderness, this ungovernable world where you can just throw your rubbish and play things aloud and not have any consideration for anyone except your family and clan because it's just not your responsibility. It is incomprehensible, for example, that British taxpayers would mow the grass verges that are on the pavement outside their house rather than just leave the council to do it if the council doesn't do it. My dad goes out and maintains those grass verges. I maintain my front garden, things like that. It's incomprehensible to them to do that, and it's incomprehensible for them to not just throw rubbish on there or throw rubbish in someone else's garden just because it's not theirs and someone else will take care of it. Northwest Europe just has a much more, and I hesitate to say it, but Protestant way of devolving morality down to the individual. And that has its excesses. See the bleeding heart of pathological compassion and liberalism and universalism. But it also has its benefits in that we maintain high standards and we consider other people in public spaces. And so this is why the Liberal Democrats are putting forward these policies about punishing people that play music aloud, but they don't realize that this is a phenomena that is culturally isolated to not the English. I wonder if these kinds of policies for making illegal immigrants voting might bring a sharp awareness of this phenomena. The final thing I'll say on this is, if they're going to give the franchise to everyone just by being a resident in the UK, does this mean that Ukrainian refugees can vote in our elections? Because there's hundreds of thousands of them here now, and they're only on temporary stay. They're not permanently settled. They're not given indefinite leave to remain. They want to go home if Ukraine ever gets all of its territory reclaimed. Fair enough. They're defending themselves against Russian aggression. I would want my homeland back too. But does this mean that under this proposed paper, if it were to be implemented, they would be able to vote in our elections, because then they could just vote us into a full-scale war, right? If there are a sufficient number of them here, or a sufficient number of them in a given locality, they could elect a very bellicose MP, especially if it was an MP who was a member of the government and became a member of the cabinet. Then they could escalate tensions and involve the host population in an armed conflict that they themselves would not fight because they couldn't join the British Army or just wouldn't be inclined to. What about if illegals can vote, a hostile country just sending thousands of its foreign nationals over the English Channel, coming into our country, and even if they're not given asylum, they're allowed to vote because they're claiming asylum and they're currently residents in the UK. So could a bunch of the members of the Taliban, considering Afghans and Eritreans are now the leading number of men crossing the Channel, just come over and soften British government policy towards terror groups? Or, for example, could the Chinese, as they did with the American southern border, just send loads of its nationals over and ensure that the Chinese government gets more of a hearing in UK foreign affairs? Or maybe Chinese students. I mean, British universities are very reliant on Chinese students. You know, we take in thousands of them every year. Can they vote? Because then you've got the sons and daughters of the CCP, who universities are reliant on because they pay all their fees and they pay more than your British student up front, and they pay for some of the best student accommodation, so they keep that industry, that sort of cottage industry in university towns alive. Could they vote? This is an insane plan to peddle foreign influence, and I think it's because, as well, partially, this Lib Dem MP is a German immigrant, and she's also of Jewish descent. Now, if you're German and Jewish, there might be some problems in the 20th century that make you a little bit more inclined to buy into the blank slate anti-racist narrative than the country should have borders narrative. Because a country should have borders narrative to your average midwit liberal has been sold as leading ineluctably to Nazism. Now, not every Jewish person thinks this. Of course, Eric Kaufman, Paul Morland, the Hazoni family, they realize that actually countries should be a bit more like Israel in being salient of themselves as a people, as a religious group, as a nation, and defend themselves against existential threats, and as a country, as a people, make alliances with countries and other peoples that have their best interests at heart, rather than being completely open borders and reducing their identity down to grey goo, when other civilizations and religions like Islam have much more strong in-group preferences and imperial ambitions, and so they will not acquiesce to this universal vision of kumbaya liberalism where we're all holding hands like John Lennon's Imagine. Instead, they'll cross your borders and kill and abuse you in the name of Allah. And so I think that is the sort of driving, noxious force behind thinking that every single person, by the virtue of being in Britain as subject to its post-war laws, is identical, is a blank slate, if given the franchise, will vote for equality. I think this is a dangerous delusion, and supporting it means they will come for the Shires. And where else they'll come for the Shires is in this plan by the Labour Party to deploy people all over Britain in taxpayer-funded accommodation. Now, I have to read this list out to you. Serco, right, is one of the security contractors, one of three, that the government uses to house illegal migrants that cross the Channel in dispersed accommodation across the country. It costs £14 a day versus the £145 a day to house them in four-star hotels. Now, any money spent on them is an injustice to the law-abiding British taxpayer, of course, but they're playing Mott and Bailey, right? They're saying, we're going to tackle the people smuggling gangs, we're going to reduce the incentives for illegal migrants across the Channel by putting them in slightly less comfortable conditions at your expense. No, people are still going to come over because relative to their third world shanty towns, dispersed private rented accommodation is much better prospect. Also, this is in the midst of said housing crisis where Labour are promising to build 1.5 million homes, but also import 2.5 million migrants over that period. So 70% of those new homes will go to migrants, and now they're procuring private rented accommodation in various towns and cities across the UK for illegal migrants. So they're rewarding them. I just have to read you this list because despite their attempt to deny it, illegal migration is coming to a town near you. And if the Lib Dems have their way, they'll get the vote. So, towns in east of England are Barbara mid-Suffolk, Breckland, Broadlands, Cambridge, East Cambridgeshire, East Suffolk, Fenland, Great Yarmouth, where Rupert Lowe I'm sure will be repelling them, Ipswich, Kings Lynn and West Norfolk, mid-Suffolk, Norfolk, Norwich, Peterborough, South Cambridgeshire in Camborne and Sawston, South Norfolk, West Suffolk in Bury, Newmarket, Brandon, Haverhill and Mildenhall. And in the Midlands it's Amber Valley, Ashfield, Bassetlaw, Birmingham, Blaby, Bolsover, Boston, Bromsgrove and Redditch, Broxtowe, Cannock Chase, Charnwood, Chesterfield, Derby, Derbyshire Dales, Dunley, East Lindsey, East Staffordshire, Erewash, Gedling, Harborough, Hertfordshire County, High Peak, Hinckley and Bosworth, Huntingdonshire, Leicester, Lincoln, Lichfield, Malvern Hills, Mansfield, Melton, Newark and Sherwood, Newcastle under Lyme. There's literally no corner of the country that won't be touched by illegal migrants. North East Derbyshire, North Kesteven, North Northamptonshire in Kettering, Corby and Wellingborough, North Warwickshire, North West Leicestershire, Nottingham, Nuneaton and Bedworth, Oadby and Wigston, Rugby, Rushcliffe, Rutland, Sandwell, Shropshire, Solihull, South Derbyshire, South Holland, South Kesteven, South Staffordshire, Staffordshire Moorlands, Stoke-on-Trent, Stratford-on-Avon, where the Bard, I'm sure, after being fresh from decolonisation, will welcome in all of its new doctors, lawyers and engineers. Tamworth, Telford and Wrekin, Walsall, Warwick, West Lindsey, West Northamptonshire, Wolverhampton, Worcester, Withercombe, and Weir Forest. Oh, and there's some more in the northwest. That's Allerdale, Barrow-in-Furness, Blackburn and Darwen, Blackpool, Bolton, Burnley, Bury, Carlisle, Cheshire East, Cheshire West and Chester, so I was right, Chorley, Copeland, Copeland, of course, Eden, Flyde, Halton, Hindburn, Knowsley, Lancaster, Liverpool, Manchester, Oldham, Pendle, Preston, Ribble Valley, Rochdale, Rosendale, Salford, Sefton, South Lakeland, South Ribble, Stockport, St Helens, Thameside, Trafford, Warrington, West Lancashire, Wigan, Wirral and Weir. There are approximately 1.3 million people on the waiting list for this dispersed accommodation at the moment. So that means that lots of the towns and cities that have seen the Pakistani rape gangs operate in their area are about to get a bunch of unvetted foreign nationals from places like Afghanistan and Eritrea, where they're more likely to commit sex offences, 20 times more likely than a British national. They're about to get a whole lot more potential offenders. And we're paying for it. And the Lib Dems think they should vote. Final point. I thought that since I haven't been around for 6 weeks, I'll do some correcting on one's ostensible own side. So Fraser Nelson is continuing to be the most incorrect man in Britain. It's getting to the point now where I feel like that one fish in SpongeBob. You know, how many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man? In the last fortnight, he has written 2 rather odious columns in the Times, and I just have to provide some corrections because he's labouring under the misapprehension that the rise of sectarian Islam will bring people back to church and that crime is actually lower because of migration. Yeah. In his most recent piece, titled Robert Jenrick's Tilt at Power Could Kill Off the Tories, so set your watch for when Robert Jenrick becomes Prime Minister, because Fraser Nelson's like the British political inverse Jim Cramer at this point. He says, immigration shot up under Tory Home Secretaries, but crime almost halved. Immigration has not sent crime surging, but if it had, who would voters blame? Well, probably the folks like you, Fraser, who pushed for open doors immigration when the Conservative Party was still going and said it was Britain's integration miracle, and has been unrepentant when corrected by the likes of Sam Bidwell, Max Tempers, etc. at the start of this year, who suggested that sectarian Islamic voting blocs and the Pakistani rape gangs aren't quite the integration miracle, and that all of this could be avoided if we just hadn't brought them here in the first place. I would like to ask Fraser Nelson a conditional hypothetical. Fraser, in turn, could you imagine how much lower crime would therefore be if we weren't importing foreign criminals? There's about 13,000 foreign nationals currently incarcerated in British prisons. Lots of them are eligible for deportation, but because of human rights legislation and the ECHR, which presumably Fraser Nelson supports being a member of, their deportation is frustrated, so we still can't remove them. Britain is number 1 in Western Europe and number 2 in all of Europe as of 2023 to 2024, for crimes committed by foreign nationals, and that's according to the Global Organised Crime Index run out of the United States government, so not a far-right fringe conspiracy blog. There are 1 in 50 Albanians in the UK that are incarcerated, and they're overrepresented as a share of the population, as are Muslims, by the way, not a religion that is indigenous to the United Kingdom, but one that Fraser Nelson has compared to the Catholics in the past. As a Catholic himself, as a Catholic myself, I'm quite offended. Muslims are officially 6.5% of the population per the 2021 census, but they're at least 18% of the prison population, and now the Muslim Brotherhood, not to be confused with the Muslim Brotherhood, not very creative with naming, but they're running a hell of a lot of the UK's prisons, so again, all of these things are avoidable. We have also 1.2 million illegal immigrants. All of those have broken the law, and I assume he's just setting that aside. Afghans and Eritreans, 20 times more likely than British national to commit a sex offence. Again, all of those crimes do not need to happen if those people were just not here. So every single crime committed by a foreign national is a consequence of government policy. So if immigration's going up and crime continues to fall, that's because of Britain's ageing population committing substantially less crime, at the same time that Britain is bringing in and battery farming at taxpayers' expense foreign criminals and sex offenders. So if we just didn't bring in those foreign criminals, crime would be even lower. Fascinating prospect. And, of course, the rape gangs, which Fraser Nelson accidentally reignited the controversy around. Every single one of those people should never have been in this country, and all of those girls, those thousands of girls, would never have had their lives ruined, or a handful of them and their families' lives ended by these foreign racist predators. Also, in his article, Our Multi-Faith Society Can Revive the Church, he wrote, "There is no shortage of people willing to proclaim a clash of civilizations, but looking around, we can see a different pattern, Britain's faiths supporting each other, with Christianity emerging stronger as a result." Now, at the Easter just past, the largest share of catechumens baptized into the Catholic Church were young men. We've got a large share of young people, aged 18 to 34, returning to church, up from 3% to about 12 to 20% in some demographics. And this isn't just all due to the migration of African Christians. This is taking place among white British men, the likes of me, and some people who got in touch to say they watched me, and my presence on media had convinced them to go back to their church and take a renewed interest in theology. So that's all very good. But the reason that Catholicism and Orthodoxy are leading the way, 2-1, outnumbering Anglicans among Zoomers, is because they're the full fat branches of Christianity that don't cave to the progressive spirit of the age. And the progressive spirit of the age also involves supporting mass immigration from the Muslim world. I mean, look at King Charles's Easter message mentioning the apparent shared values of Islam and Judaism with Christianity. I don't think a religion which says in the Quran that cutting the hearts out of hypocrites and non-believers is the supreme achievement in the eyes of Allah, and in the hadiths that Judgment Day will come when the rocks and trees come alive and announce where the Jews are hiding so that Muslims can kill them. I don't think they're all that interested in interfaith dialogue and mutually reinforcing a return to the pews. Do you, Fraser? No, I think that this is a raising of salience among young men who are more likely to listen to Anons on Twitter, or the likes of me, possibly, or the likes of Jordan Peterson, than yourself or any of the establishment conservatives, and are realizing that the tree of civilization has been cut off of the roots of tradition and religion. Meanwhile, there is the growth of a muscular, even militant religion, Islam, across the European continent, and so they need to tap back into the legitimate moral substrate of their civilization in order to renew it and to defend it. And it's quotes like this that do make me wonder whether or not Fraser Nelson is playing like the wrestling heel, as if he's being such an exaggerated ideologue about someone being British if they're born in Britain, and there being no such thing as an English ethnic identity, and that the growth of Islam is good for Christianity somehow, actually. I wonder if he's almost doing that to provoke a kind of reaction from types like me, in order to strengthen right-wing arguments and allow traditional conservatism and patriotism and Christianity, specifically Catholicism, to flourish anew. But maybe attributing 5D chess as a motive is far too charitable. Again, I don't see a great vision of ethnic and religious harmony and an integration miracle out of the fact that Muhammad is now the #1 baby name in England for newborns. I see instead factions of a re-Christianizing Gen Z and lots of second and third generation immigrants who 75% of whom think Hamas did nothing wrong on October 7th, and 52% who want blasphemy laws for depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. I see them squabbling over whether or not they get a new crusade or a caliphate. So, funnily enough, no, I don't think that the growth of Islam is a great thing for Christian churches in England. And funnily enough, I don't think that mass immigration has done wonders for crime in Britain. In fact, all of the police's focus on arresting 33 people a day, 12,000 a year for speech violations is brought about to keep community cohesion and tensions between competing identity groups in a kind of state of faux stability. If we had not imported said tribal minorities, see commentary earlier in the show on the brewing civil war between Indians and Pakistanis in Britain, if we had not imported that, we wouldn't need these diversity management strategies of hate speech laws in the first place. And the police could actually focus on tackling proper crimes, because the majority of police forces across England haven't solved a single burglary in the last year. Crime might be down as well because people just have stopped reporting it because they've got lack of faith in the police. I wonder why when they're the Diversity Protection Squad. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to make this a weekly thing from now on. I've felt like my spirit is dwindling when I'm not in front of a camera ranting at it for your enjoyment. And I hope you did enjoy it. If you did, stick around, subscribe. There is a bell notification button on YouTube so you can get alerted when the full episode or clips come out. Substack link is down in the description. Subscribe for free if you want clips, and do feel free to have a paid subscription for the paywalled analysis. But that's the only thing that I'm going to lock behind the paywall. Thank you very much for watching, and until next week, take care, God bless, and goodbye.